This afternoon, we are really blessed, actually, because Joanne described Lea as a sort of figure of great intellectual energy, but she is, beyond just that, has written a really miraculous book. And if you haven't had a chance to read it yet, I hope that after this session you'll go off and buy it, and I'm sure Lea will sign it for you too. It's an extraordinary story. It's autobiography. It's non-fiction, but it's about one of the most intriguing tales I've read in a number of years, I have to say. So let's start at the very beginning of the journey, because you grew up in Albania. This book begins, there you are, quite small, you're at school, you've got this extraordinary teacher who tells you everything, and you come home being the star pupil in the class, brandishing all these ideas to your family. But right away, there's just a little bit of mystery going on, because you're not quite getting the reaction from your parents or your grandmother that you'd expect.
Yeah, so I grew up in the 80s in Albania, and in the 80s Albania was probably one of the most isolated countries in Europe. It was a communist country, and it had fallen out with almost every other communist country that there was at that point. So it had fallen out with Yugoslavia, who incidentally helped it become a communist country in the 40s, then with the Soviet Union when they de-Stalinized, and then with China when they became revisionist. And so when I was growing up in this myth, with this idea that Albania was the freest country in the world and the only one that was really committed to communism, which was obviously the best theory that there was, which brought justice to the world. But in a family where there were little glimpses and mysteries about the fact that my parents might not have completely adhered to what I was told about my society, without, though, ever telling me that they did not adhere. So on the surface, they always supported whatever I went home with from school, and telling them that this was the right place to be, and that I was fighting for freedom, and I wanted to be a pioneer and a good citizen, and they always reaffirmed that and reassured me of that. But then there were always little things happening over the course of my childhood that suggested that their position was slightly different.
You say here, I'd grown up believing that my family shared my enthusiasm for the party, the desire to serve the country, the contempt for our enemies, and the concern that we had no war heroes to remember. This time it felt different. My questions about politics, the country, the protests, and how to explain what was going on found only curt, evasive answers. I wanted to know why everyone demanded freedom if we were already one of the freest countries on earth, as teacher Nora always said. And when I mentioned her name at home, my parents rolled their eyes. I started to suspect they were not in the best position to answer me, and I could no longer trust them. And not only did my questions about the country go unanswered, I now also wondered about what kind of family I had been born into. I doubted them, and by doubting, found that my grip on who I was began to slip.
Yeah, so this was December 1990, 1 year after the fall of the Berlin Wall, which was introduced in Albania as an event that only really touched the parts of communist countries that were corrupt anyway in the first place. And so whatever had happened to them wasn't going to happen in Albania, because Albania had always charted its own path to being a socialist country. And the book begins with me ending up by chance in a street protest. The street protest that started in December at the University of Tirana as protests about economic conditions, and not really as politics or as anything to do with politics, but very quickly deteriorated. And I remember going home and finding my parents were listening to the radio and seemed very interested. Up to that point, the protesters had been defined hooligans on television, and we had been told in school that hooligans were the kind of people that went to football matches and burned flags and destroyed everything, and they were mostly a phenomenon of the West, but they had only recently appeared in the East and changed things there, but that there was no risk that anything like that would happen to Albania. Whereas I remember 1990, this kind of moment where at some point I realized that my parents actually supported the hooligans, or seemed to support, indicated from their body language, from the kinds of things that they did, from the way in which they engaged with the radio, where there were famous intellectuals from the university who had begun to give interviews about the importance of having political pluralism in Albania. I discovered that they were actually seemed to sympathize with these hooligans that were my most dreaded enemies. And that's how the story begins, with this effort to try and understand why is it that I was convinced that I had this truth about the society in which I lived, and the fact that it was the freest society on earth, and why is it that my truth was different from my parents' truth. And so the first part of the book is all a journey of almost emerging from a kind of Platonic cave where you're told certain things which you think are true, and then you discover that it's all ideology and propaganda, and you begin to, in a way, tear this veil.
Well, we'll go through that a bit more, but to begin with, there is this word which keeps popping up over and over and over again to explain things, and it's biography. Tell us a bit more about biography.
So biography was a kind of, as I was growing up, was a word I was surrounded by, but as all big words and obvious words, you never really ask what it is, because you take it to be so obvious that it's almost stupid to ask, well, what does it mean to have a biography, since it's all about biographies. So I grew up surrounded by this word and with qualifiers on the word. So people would say someone's biography was good or bad, was cleaned or stained. When I had a new friend at school, my parents would say, what's their biography like? And sometimes they'd write a piece of paper for work and they'd say, don't forget to put a few lines on your biography. So biography was basically, but it was a kind of concept that you don't interrogate and you don't ask your parents what is a biography, because it's so obvious that it feels stupid of you to ask them. But I knew it had something to do with the ways, the circumstances in which you were born, and also something to do with the way in which the circumstances you were born shaped your path in life and shaped what you couldn't do and what opportunities would be available to you or not. And so I knew that I grew up in a family with a somewhat dubious biography, but I didn't quite know what exactly it was and how dubious it was until the point at which all of this reality began to reveal itself in 1990.
And one of the things about that culture and your upbringing in school terms was that no one could be special, and yet it was pretty apparent as the biography begins to reveal itself that you came from a rather special family.
Yeah, one of the things, for example, that always stood out about when I was a child was the fact that I spoke French, and my grandmother spoke French to me. It was the first language I grew up with. And it was not because there were French minorities in Albania. My grandmother spoke French with an Albanian, with an accent. And she had never been to France. We didn't have any French relatives. And every time I asked, why is it that I, unlike all the other children, have to speak French? The reason that was given back was something to do with the French Revolution or with Cosette or with people I liked from watching puppet shows in communist Albania. And so always some kind of intellectual / political reason, very abstract, which had nothing to do with the fact that it was just me and not other children. And so, but then that you couldn't really push that line of inquiry very further, because again, it was one of these things that is strange and mysterious but gets shut down very quickly. And so that was one example of how, or another thing that was an example of how my parents were slightly different was when Enver Hoxha was the communist leader of Albania, died. And I remember the whole of Albania was in grief. There was this funeral where women were pulling their hair and crying and throwing themselves on the floor because it was a day of national mourning. And I was sitting there devastated watching this funeral with my parents. I was 5.5 at the time. And at some point, my parents suddenly started talking about the funeral music. And they had this conversation about, is this an Albanian composer or is it Beethoven's funeral march? And I remember, I was really, really young, so this was before I went to school, but I remember thinking, why are they talking about music? This is such a horrible day for our nation. And my parents, here they are, and they started having this kind of petty fight between my parents about how my father didn't have a classical education, so how could he tell the difference between these two composers? And so they got into this family dispute, which indicated that, again, their commitment wasn't as great as mine was. And certainly their sorrow about the death of Enver Hoxha didn't seem to be as significant as what I assume the majority of Albanians had.
The tale is one full of poverty in a way to begin with. People were very poor in Albania in those days, and there's a very disturbing and amusing all-in-one tale about a Coca-Cola can and your neighbours.
So Coca-Cola cans in Albania, when I was growing up, Coca-Cola wasn't really sold, and so there was no Coca-Cola as a drink. So Coca-Cola was only known in the form of a Coca-Cola can, not in the form of the drink that it's known here. And the can was a marker of social status because it usually indicated some kind of connection to the Western world. Because we didn't have them, they weren't sold in the shops. It was only if someone had been outside Albania that they would bring a can with them, and then people would, and usually it was an empty can, or even if it was a liquid, nobody ever saw the liquid. Every Albanian family has a different story about Coca-Cola cans, but basically the universal was that everybody would display the empty can on their bookshelves and keep it there as a prized possession. And so the story I tell about the can in my book was when my mother had bought a second-hand can from a colleague at work. She was a school teacher. And at some point, the can disappeared from our bookshelf and reappeared on our closest neighbor's television on top of their shelf. At which point, and these were our neighbors, were the most trusted people we had in the neighborhood. So, you know, they would look after me when my parents were gone. They had the key to our house. They knew where our money was, the savings. This was before banks and so on. So people kept their money in their pocket or under the mattress or whatever. So they knew everything about us. But somehow when this Coca-Cola can reappeared on this neighbor's shelf, my mother went and accused the neighbor of stealing. And which is something she would have never done before, and a dispute arose, and eventually I have this story of how I was really destroyed by the fight and the fact that they weren't speaking to each other anymore because the neighbor didn't accept the charges, and they were accusing, I remember my mother was accusing the neighbor of being a peasant, and the other one was saying, you're a bourgeois dressed in teacher's clothes, and all this kind of, but anyway, so the story was of how this symbol of the West had basically come, which was in the form of this consumer commodity, had basically come in between these two Albanian families that were normally very, very close to each other, and where the background in society was one of great solidarity and great community spirit, because there was such scarcity that you could only, in some ways, survive it by putting efforts together and by being solidaristic. And where the one instance where this neighborly solidarity broke down was when the Coca-Cola can entered the families.
Only, if I remember rightly, to be replaced by the Fanta can as being even more exclusive. Now, but so much of this book is really about your own personal journey of revelation as Albania's change occurs. And what's in some ways heartbreaking is that the demystification for you as a child a year ahead of your age at school, being a great intellectual talent, which in some ways could go both ways, and there's a charming story about you finally being allowed to go to school a year early and so forth. But you say the other children had simply mastered the slogans and gone on reciting them. But when I swore but there was a difference between us. I believed I knew nothing else. Now I had nothing left except for all the small, mysterious fragments of the past, like the solitary notes of a long-lost opera. Looking back on it now, years, decades away, does it still break your heart a little bit, that loss?
Yeah, although I guess childhood is always a loss for everyone. So the story in my book is one of emerging, and it's a coming-of-age story, so it's one of emerging from the protected, sheltered world of your childhood and entering this world of uncertainty, but at a time in which also everyone else around you is uncertain. And so the crisis is not just the crisis of natural growth and adolescence and just becoming an adult, which is a crisis that everyone experiences one way or another, but what happens when on top of that crisis, you also have a more general collective identity crisis where a whole country doesn't know what they stand for anymore, and where there's been this earth-shattering revolution and a complete change in the system of values, in what people believed, in how they relate to each other, in what freedom means to them. And that was particularly traumatic and confusing, because one thing is when you make these discoveries, you know, every child discovers eventually that Santa isn't real, or you know, they all have these personal disappointments, and in some ways also the disappointment towards the parents. That's a natural process. But it's different when you realize that your parents also don't really know, and the world has also changed really for them, while they say to you, you know, finally everybody is free and we all have freedom, but you see that what that actually means, nobody really has a good grip on. All they know is that the past is over and the future is open.
And a lot of this book is about the agonies of freedom and the agonies of transition, and all of these Westerners coming in and starting to talk about market economies and terrible loss of life in demonstrations and everything else. To begin with, it must have seemed exciting. But pretty quickly, it turned out to be a lot more complicated, didn't it?
Yeah, and the book really is about, in a way, the search for freedom, both and for autonomy, both in the individual and in the nation. And this process of kind of reaching maturity and overcoming these doubts of childhood and the naivety and all the things that you believe. but it's also about the difficulty of decoupling what the real meaning of freedom is from everything else that you are told freedom is, which is ideology often and propaganda, and it's presented to you in a certain way, but is not necessarily that way. So it really is about this divorce between, I guess, essence and appearance. Things are one way, and then they're told to be another way. And in crisis moments is when we understand that these two things could pull apart. So for us, after 1990, everything that we held to be true before, at least everything that I held to be true, my parents were slightly different because they were dissidents and they'd had this very, very complex family history. So I discovered eventually that my grandfather had been to prison, that my parents had very elaborate codes for talking about these things. So there's a whole first part of the book is about just these other secrets, these family secrets and so on. But the second half is also about how this whole set of concepts gets replaced by another set of concepts. So you had the party before 1990 that was responsible for everything, and then the new discourse was all civil society. Or you had, the dictatorship of the proletariat before and the bourgeoisie that was your enemy, and then afterwards your enemy was corruption and the effort was to develop a flourishing civil society. All the while grappling with the symptoms of this very, very difficult transition, which led to huge emigration, huge job losses, the fact that people were torn apart from their families, that eventually there was a civil war caused by the collapse of financial pyramid schemes, and that all of that meant that all the promise of freedom and everything that people had believed would come after 1990 actually comes in the form of some great disillusionment.
And your family lost all their savings?
They all lost their savings, and most of the country actually lost their savings. People had sold, because after 1990, we didn't have a banking sector in Albania. So after 1990, we had to develop a financial sector, and everybody was told, look, and we're in a capitalist society. The spirit of capitalism is save and invest money, which is what people did. And then there were all these new financial companies that emerged that promised great returns, great interests for their savings. And if you're told we're no longer in communism, the free market works in the way that you put your savings and then somehow the invisible hand does its work and everybody gets a share of the invisible hand's products, that's what they did. And then eventually they all collapsed and people had actually sold their houses to get savings enough to put them in these pyramid schemes, at which point the state really lost control over the use of force, and there was shooting and looting of weapons everywhere, and everything was breaking apart.
And because of the nature of the protectiveness of the state in which you grew up in, do you think that made the general population much more vulnerable for exploitation when the change happened?
I think there was a sense in which people didn't know how the new world would work, and so they had no tools to tell, what is a reliable investment from what's a not reliable investment and what's a serious company. But on the other hand, the transition was also really guided by international institutions. So in 1990, all of Eastern Europe experienced what was called shock therapy, which was basically you had to go really hard on privatization and opening up to new markets and liberalizing and so on, because the faster you did this, it would be very costly and there would be sacrifices required in the short term, but the faster you did it, the more likely it would be that it would be beneficial in the long run. And people really trusted international institutions because they had grown in this society that was extremely isolated, but also with some sense of hope and promise from the West. And when things changed and the West came in the form of the IMF and the World Bank and these international experts that came to guide Albania in the transition, they didn't really warn either that there would be these consequences from market fallout. And so it's true that they were obviously more vulnerable because they had grown up in this very secluded, isolated society. But on the other hand, there was also more general responsibility from global institutions to actually not operate in these countries in the way in which they operated.
Well, we only discovered that afterwards. I mean, in some ways, N.M. Rothschild created the Russian oligarchs, if I remember rightly, in the Thatcher era. But there's some such charming moments, and one of the ones that's just really striking in the book is when your grandmother gets a letter and you and her are allowed finally to travel, and you go to Athens. I think because one of your neighbours produces 5 Napoleonic gold sovereigns, which gives you the money because you've already got the passport and the visa, but you didn't have the money to get there. And you describe this sort of extraordinary revelation for you, finally, of leaving this enclosed world. And there was a lovely line you had about seeing people walking with dogs on leashes, and you'd only been used to people walking with the sort of wild dog, nipping at their ankles behind them.
Yeah, so there were a number of revelations. It actually all started with the visa, because in Albania, when I was growing up, we couldn't travel, and I knew we couldn't travel. Everybody knew that there was no chance you'd ever leave Albania. My parents hadn't left Albania until 1990, so they were like 40, 42, 43. And my grandmother, who had traveled because she was born in Salonika in the Ottoman Empire and had come to Albania and for a whole series of personal reasons had remained in Albania, basically had always told me, we can't travel because the roads are closed and we don't have a passport. And then I discovered in 1990 that the passport wasn't enough, that you actually needed a visa, and that also on top of needing a visa, you actually had to pay for the visa, which was not a trivial cost at that point, because if you emerge from these state-paid salaries and the visa fees are set by foreign embassies, then the whole thing looks very, very different from the inside. So I remember first being really perplexed that it wasn't just your country that would stop you from traveling and leaving it, but it was also other countries that would stop you from entering there. And there was this huge asymmetry in how we thought about the right to leave and the right to enter another country. And then another thing that really stood out for me when we then eventually did make it to Greece with these 5 Napoleon gold coins that had been converted into $100, which my grandmother sewed into her dress because that was the safest place she could keep it, because they'd heard that in the West people steal wallets, and so she wouldn't put it in a wallet, she actually sewed it in her dress. And so there's all these stories. Then we arrived in Greece, and I remember one thing that, in addition to the fact that, as you said, we had dogs that would follow, stray dogs following people as opposed to people following dogs, as is the case here. Also, there was lots of other things. So one, I had never seen, for example, advertising ever in my life. So
except
writings
the Coca-Cola
on walls. Well, we didn't know it was advertising. No, we actually that would yeah. So writings on walls for me meant long live the party, long live the dictatorship of the proletariat, whatever, pioneers, triumph, try and be good as Uncle Enver, all these kind of emotionally motivating slogans. That was the only thing that would be written in Albanian walls. And so then I remember when I traveled to Greece and I would see McDonald's, Marks and Spencer's, whatever. And I asked my grandma, so what are they? What are these slogans?
Yeah.
And the fact that they were to sell products as opposed to push a political message to people was, again, a really strange discovery, which I think people here don't think about advertising as a form of political persuasion, but in the end it might be.
Very much so. And I'm intrigued as well by having had such a disjointed but shut away kind of childhood. What do you think that's done to you traumatically? Now you're an adult and you're a mum and live somewhere in a totally different kind of world.
So I think two things. One is that it's really hard when you have these traumas that in some ways make your identity. So when your identity is made by trauma, in some ways it's really hard to say what it's done to you because the trauma keeps revealing itself. And so you really only maybe know at the end of your life what it's actually done because you need the full life to see it. But in the immediate term, I think it's made me really reluctant to accept what I'm told in a way and to accept the truths that everybody seems to accept. So it's made me really skeptical and really questioning. The fact that you were in this bubble and everything that you thought was in a bubble, and in philosophy there's all these thought experiments, there's the evil genius of Descartes and there's Platonic cave in Plato and all of these things, and there's a magic pill and so on. You're in this bubble and you assume that everything you see is truth. Then then that truth falls apart, and then you're in this other world and someone tells you, well, now this is the truth. How would you know that that is the truth if that one wasn't the truth? So this is I think that's what, in the end, what made me study philosophy. It was in part this effort to try and understand what are the tools that you have to try and understand what is true and what is someone is just presenting you something as though it were the truth.
And therefore, does it appear to you that living in London and being surrounded by all of us, that we're too trusting in some ways, having not had that kind of upbringing?
I think it's more that maybe there are types of injustice and exclusion that people seem to accept as though they were an inevitable part of life here, in a way in which you don't accept if you've gone through a system that has collapsed and you have seen the collapse of it and you have questioned the injustice of that system and you've seen how is it that people over the long term develop this resistance to the system and they no longer believe what they're told. So I think here it's difficult because while in Albania, and this is why the book really is about freedom and the different kinds of unfreedom that we experience, while in communist Albania you had this very direct form of oppression, so you have a state and a party that are responsible for taking away freedom. In capitalist societies or in the West, you have types of unfreedom that are more anonymous and where you have a structure of complicity of thousands, millions of people that create certain effects by just interacting with each other, and everyone just does what they're supposed to do within the social role that they're ascribed, but that generates these unjust consequences and generate social exclusion and social injustice. And so for me, living in London, I mean, people say you've gone to London, so you're now in the West and you're in this capitalist country, but I live in West London, so Acton, and you take the bus one way and you end up in Notting Hill and Knightsbridge, and you take the bus the other way and you end up Willesden Green, Willesden Junction and Harlesden, and this is not nice, and they are two different worlds. And they're all in one city within kilometers from each other. And for me, that's something that makes me question the legitimacy of the system in which I live, but doesn't seem to bother too many people in the way in which it really bothers me.
Indeed. And therefore, looking back now, and I know this might seem an odd question, but did you leave, in some ways, were there some elements of your socialist upbringing that you treasure, that was good, that got left behind in the change?
I think there was something about education that really mattered and that was really cherished by people, and reading and curiosity, which is partly, it's hard to know how much of that is part of the system and how much of that is part of the fact that the system doesn't work in the way it's meant to work, that there's censorship. And so people then become really curious and try to access lots of books and lots of, or they can't travel and therefore they travel in their minds. And so it's really hard to say what is it that comes from actually having positive experiences within the system and what actually comes from the system operating in the way it operates. But there are certainly things that got lost in the process. The fact that people were much more solidaristic with each other, that there was these really strong neighborly relations, the fact that education was really important and prized, the fact that there were these holidays for workers and people had subsidized by the state, and that there was a structure in which people, there was a lot of poverty, but there was also a lot of equality in that poverty. And in some ways, I think that tempered it for everyone.
Well, that's what I meant, vis-a-vis Willesden and Notting Hill. I remember going as a guest of the Cuban government to Cuba, and what was absolutely striking was how Castro, one of his first acts in power, was to get everybody literate from the cities to go out in the countryside and teach everyone to read. And I think Cuba still has a higher literacy rate than the UK. There's something quite fundamental, therefore, which is what you're alluding to, I imagine, when you're talking about education and the importance of it. And, the words levelling up appear quite a lot in our lives, or have done the last year or two. And that seemed to be a fundamental thing that happened in the socialist era, where at least the starting point was the same for most people.
Yeah, I know. That's certainly one aspect of it. Although I think it was also right to be critical of that, because I don't think equality in poverty is what a socialist society should aspire to. I think it should aspire to combining equality and freedom and to raising the level for everybody. And that's sort of something that I don't think you can really achieve with free market economies and with globalization the way it works. And so it's in some ways an aspiration to try and have a world in which we all try to work and create political institutions that guarantee that there are no arbitrary uses of power one way or another, whether it's within the states by rich citizens and poor citizens, but also in the global system, which is a system of a number of states that exercise power on behalf of everybody else.
Exactly. Now, we're running out of time, so I just want to ask you about how this book happened, because you got here, you got to the LSE, you're now a top professor there, you're lecturing all over the world, partly about this book, but also about your academic stuff as well. Did you just think, I'm going to write my story? How did all that happen?
Yeah, no, I was going to write a book on the idea of freedom in the liberal and the socialist traditions of intellectual history, basically a book of intellectual history. And then we were in Berlin and I was doing the research for this book, and then the COVID-19 happened. And it was meant to be a book for the general public, so not an academic book, but a book that was more accessible. But then COVID-19 happened and I had my kids scattered around the house. The lockdown happened and I was writing from this cupboard in Berlin, which was large, but not designed as a library. And it made me think about freedom and this connection between the universality of freedom and the concept of freedom, this very abstract way in which if you say freedom, people think it's something strange and difficult to understand. And the immediate existential experience of actually writing from a cupboard, and so living the consequences of unfreedom. And again, it was at a time in which governments were suspending all the rights, the right to association and the right to travel and the freedom to see your relatives and so on. These were all liberal governments. And the ease with which all of these things were being suspended without proper democratic scrutiny, to me, was really bizarre. And also it was bizarre how there didn't seem to be an uproar against that, even though I could see I take the point about social responsibility and the importance of, not spreading the virus and so on, but just the way in which the state of emergency was suddenly declared, and the state of emergency was one thing, and liberal democracy was another thing, and it was okay to somehow stop worrying about liberal democracy and think about the state of emergency, made me begin to think about, the emergencies I'd gone through in Albania, and the transition in Albania, and how things changed, and what it felt like to be in a crisis, and what it felt like to experience all these big questions in your immediate life, and thinking about how are people going to take this in the West, and what is it going to do to them. And so I started thinking about my life and these experiences in Albania as a way to kind of orient myself in this COVID-19 confusion, and that's how the book came out.
Well, I'm very glad we didn't have an academic tract in a way, because it might have got lost in the academic world, and instead it's won the top non-fiction prize in the UK, which that must have been quite an exciting moment.
Yeah, it was. It was the thing that was really exciting about the book's reception and winning all these prizes is that I always wrote in English from a point of view of feeling that I couldn't write in English, that it was really hard. So I started writing the book in English, but it's not my first language, not even my second, it's not even my third language. So basically I grew up with all these other languages, and then I came to English as an adult, and then started writing this because my academic work had been in English. So it started as an academic book in English, and then it was becoming more and more literary. And so I wrote it from a point of feeling completely inadequate linguistically to convey these experiences in English. And then I moved to try and write it in Albanian and discovered that I had actually not written in Albanian for the last 25 years. Yeah. So I was in this position of complete linguistic homelessness. And that was really nice about getting the prizes for the writing quality, was that you write as someone who is a linguistic nomad, and then you get recognized, and someone gives you a temporary home for this writing, and that's very nice.
Well, you share that with Elif Shafak, two wonderful authors writing their third language. It puts us all to shame. Now, we're running short of time, and I bet somebody in the audience would love to ask a question. We've got the microphones at hand. This lady here, if we can dash up here, thank you.
I'm so interested to know, as the two truths between what you'd learnt and between what your parents were more or less hiding came together, and you discovered what was going on. Were you very cross? Was it a very difficult period for you?
I think more than cross, I was really confused, because I just didn't know who to believe, in the sense that my teacher had told me certain things and my parents were telling me other things. But the other reason that I was very confused and very upset was that I had grown up to believe in class war and in fighting the bourgeoisie and the aristocracy and taking up the cause of the proletariat. And I was convinced of the cause of the proletariat. So when I discovered that my mom's family were property owners, so they were the bourgeoisie, and my father's family, they were old aristocracy, and so landowning elite, it was like the class enemy had been living in me for all these years, and I'd never known it. So I was really angry with the predicament more than with my parents. I think with my parents I understood it very quickly, because they'd done it to protect themselves. They couldn't tell me what it was, because otherwise I'd go around and they'd be in prison, they'd be put in jail. But the other reason that was, I think, why they did it was that I was a very ambitious child and wanted to be a good citizen and a good pioneer. And my parents didn't want to kill that ambition too early, because if they'd killed it, then there would have been no way of doing anything in life. You just grow up disillusioned and skeptical. And that I'm very grateful for now, because although I'm very skeptical and very critical, I'm not someone who is nihilistic. And so I'm always very hopeful and always try to think about what is the right thing to do under the circumstances, and sort of think with a sense of moral responsibility. And I think if my parents had not protected that early on, it would have been really hard. And in fact, I think a lot of people from Eastern Europe have exactly that they criticize everything. They see what's wrong in every society. You talk to my mother about the war in Ukraine, and she's like, well, of course, what do you expect? Of course Putin does. Of course that. Of course, there's nothing surprises them, and nothing shocks them, and nothing is, there's no sense of kind of moral outrage. It's like everybody's self-interested, and everybody does the wrong thing, and everybody does it for cynical reasons. And that sense of cynicism, I think, is really widespread in that part of the world, and I think what my parents did has sheltered me from a lot of it, and I'm grateful for it, because otherwise it's really hard to think about the future with that set of moral motives.
Yes, lady here, right in the front row. Front row? Sorry, did you have one? Okay.
Just through your research and your personal experiences, have you settled on what you think could be the best, in quotes, political and social construct, or are you still in the sort of grey area?
So there's two things. I have my take, but I'm usually reluctant to share it, because I think people shouldn't trust what one person tells them about what the world should look like. I think the first
we want to know.
step...
We're interested.
Yeah, it's like, I'm not the Messiah.
No.
I'm just a naughty girl.
Writing in your third language. Yeah.
No, but I think, so I really care, I really care about democracy, and I take the ideal of democracy very seriously, and I take the idea of democratic representation very seriously. And I think for democracy to work, it needs to be a global system. And what we have now is not democracy, and it's not globally spread and understood. So what you need is a system of states that is democratically run, where you don't have a bunch of states that, capitalizing on a certain very problematic history and past politics, can actually run and rule the world, but where that power is shared properly democratically, so have proper global democratic structures, a UN Council. That's not, well, we can give lots of examples. And domestically, you also need democracy at all spheres of life. So you need political democracy, you need economic democracy, you need democracy within the family. So I'm a kind of radical Democrat, which cherry picks from the liberal and the socialist tradition and tries to think about what is the best that these traditions can offer and how you can then think about that. But I also think, as I say, that intellectuals have a role to play in that, but ultimately what you need is institutions that can survive individuals and processes that are put in motion where all of us can do our share to bring those institutions to being, and where I don't think anyone has the monopoly on either the truth or what needs to be done.
One more question. Yeah, here. This gentleman here.
Would you care to comment?
Hang on. Just grab the mic. Thank you.
Would you care to comment on recent developments in Albanian politics, which I have heard from a liberal socialist background are quite encouraging? Can you encourage us at all?
Well, yeah, in a sense that the problems of Albania used to be only the problems of Albania during Enver Hoxha's period, because it was so cut off from the rest of the world that they were all basically homegrown problems. And now the problems of Albania are the problems of the world. And so in some ways, Albania is more integrated. But I think one of the things that holds back the country, and actually a range of countries that are in the same predicament, is this transitional narrative. So there is a sense in which these are countries in transition. And I think in a world of global crisis, where all of us are trying to understand risk and to understand uncertainty and to figure out what kind of future we should be living, I don't think there are countries that have the truth and countries that don't. And so the transition narrative, I think, prevents the so-called transitional countries from actually contributing to the debate as equals. And sometimes I think the fact that Albanians, for example, have experienced trauma makes them see themselves as victims of history. But actually, having gone through a crisis, having gone through trauma, and having gone through a system change, gives you a kind of epistemic insight into change from which other countries might also benefit. So what you think makes you a victim could also give you agency if you properly valued your resources and what you could contribute intellectually. But I think somehow the dominant discourse is one where you have these countries that made it and countries that haven't quite made it and need to make it, and where I think, in fact, what we have is a world in which we have crisis and all of us are more or less in the same boat, and we all need to just come together and find the best way to help each other out and to figure out the responses for the future. So in that sense, I think Albania is like many other countries with its historical specificities and goes through similar processes, but I think it's held back by thinking of itself as a country that needs to catch up with something else that is going on.
We're all trapped by our own narratives, really, at heart. Thank you so much for gracing us with your stimulating mind, stimulating presence, and we're really blessed to have this book out there, and I do encourage you to go and get hold of a copy, and Lea will now head that way and start signing. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.